Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I have to acknowledge that you've come out again and again and again and again. This is at least 10 times, and 2 days ago was Groundhog Day. So come out again and again and again and again. But I have to additionally say two things. One, I have a complicated relationship with Punxsutawney Phil because I grew up in western Pennsylvania. I grew up about 25 miles south of Punxsutawney. And the Punxsutawney, the hometown is Indiana, Pennsylvania. And the Indiana-Punxsutawney rivalry in football was equivalent, though at a smaller scale, to Ohio State, Michigan. That is to say, it was the last game of the year. The rivalry was bitter. All the cheerleaders had ground chuck stickers all over their uniforms for the day. So that left me sort of in a tribe being anti-Punxsy because they were our rivals. Yet anybody comes along and tells me about, I don't know, Sun Prairie, Jimmy, or any of those others, posers, suddenly I change teams. So this is sort of a theme that I think fits kind of nicely with what I'm going to speak about today. I was interested and a little humbled last week when Julie mentioned that this was going to be the sermon, or this is going to be the sermon for this day, and this is typically a day whenever we apparently have something else. You apparently have a usual service Sunday, in reference or to honor people that have done service on behalf of the congregation, and that sounded suspiciously to me like a liturgical calendar, that we do this every year at this time. And I'm a recovering Catholic, so anything that smacks of sacred, which Julie used the word sacred for my talk, may be just a little bit uncomfortable. But despite that, again, I was humbled to be considered sort of a spot in the calendar. So, to what I was going to say today. I am Will Taylor. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. I'm a scientist. That's a big circle. I'm a botanist. That's a smaller circle, but it's inside of the other circle. Okay. I'm a paleobotanist, which is a smaller category inside a botanist, inside of biologist or scientist. I'm also something called a palynologist, which is a little circle that's mostly inside of paleobotanist, which is inside of botanist, which is inside of scientist. So these are what we refer to as nested circles. So which am I? Which one of those is my identity? Well, of course, it's all of them. But the groups they define differ. So is it really? Are they really equivalent? I'm a teacher. Well, I was a teacher. Am I now? I'm retired. I'm a retired teacher. That doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Department chair. I had that role. I like that one as an identifier. Had a lot of gravitas. I'm a birder, but I don't consider myself to be a twitcher, if you know what that term means. That is somebody that chases birds all over the country, but I'm the other one. I'm an Italian American. Simply saying that sounds a little ridiculous. Despite the fact that I'm fully half Italian, I don't identify really with the culture much at all. My mother was raised in a time of assimilation, and she passed that along to her children. I'm a man. I'm a cisgender man. I'm a cisgender heterosexual man. I'm a cisgender heterosexual polyamorous man. Each modifier of that limits it, but it also changes the identity. Or does it? If so, how much? I sometimes ride a bike, but I don't consider myself to be a cyclist. I'm a racquetball player, but I've not played in years, and likely never will again. Is that still part of my identity? So identity. It's clearly a complicated subject, and the Walt Whitman reading underscored that earlier in the presentation. So what is it really? Well, as with all things we need to define, we turn to the source of all truths, Wikipedia. Identity is the qualities, beliefs, personality traits, appearance, and or expressions that characterize a person or group. The etymology of the term is from the Latin noun identitas, which emphasizes an individual's mental image of themselves and their, quote, sameness with others, end quote. So identity encompasses various aspects, such as occupational, religious, national, ethnic or racial, gender, educational, generational, political, among others. There are a lot of different ways we can define it. Another way to think about it in a little bit more focused way, I think, we can turn to an essay by a Stanford political scientist whose name is James Fearon, who had this to say about identity. Identity is presently used in two linked senses, which may be termed social and personal. In the former sense, social, an identity simply refers to a social category, a set of persons marked by a label and distinguished by rules deciding membership and alleged characteristics or attributes. In the second sense, personal identity, it is some distinguishing characteristic or characteristics that a person takes special pride in or views as socially consequential or more or less unchangeable. So starting with the social identity, I trace the roots of the social identity to the origin of our species. We evolved as isolated, small bands of related members, small tribes, in a very open landscape, that landscape being the African savanna. Small bands would occasionally, but possibly rarely, encounter other bands, and it was of great survival value to be able to recognize members of your band from others who were rival, possibly even hostile bands. It answered the question of, to what group do I belong? As for the other aspect of identity, the personal identity, I think we have to do a bit more soul searching, both as individuals and as a species. It's a little bit more existential. It's more of a matter of what is my place in the world, even how am I important. As a species, we've been wrestling with this one for a long time. I'm a big fan of history, and as a way of appreciating context, I like to take a quick look back, and I can look at a nice small subject like the history of science. We can go the whole way back. We can go back to the Greeks. The Greeks were really the first to trust human senses as opposed to just thinking about things as a reliable source of truth. And not just any Greeks, Aristotle in particular concluded that humans are animals. He departed from his mentor, Plato's, teachings by drawing in conclusions based on what he saw rather than just rationalizing about it. We could consider this a very early form of scientific thinking. Now, when Rome fell and the Dark Ages descended and we misplaced, so to speak, all that classical knowledge, particularly the Greeks, the influence of Catholicism elevated us to God's children, chosen ones, the masters of all dominion. This was an appealing identity for us because we like being the center of everything, including the universe. Then along came Copernicus, who demoted Earth from the center of the universe to saying we're just a minor planet around the sun. And as you may all realize or remember, the church was not particularly happy about that. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, found, quote, vehemently suspect of heresy, end quote, and placed under house arrest for the last decades of his life. Another scientist and philosopher of a similar age, Giordano Bruno, was a little less fortunate. He was publicly burned at the stake in 1600. Now, recovering that realization that we are just animals is frankly still ongoing. How many times have you heard the phrase, humans and animals, as though that's not redundant? Scientists were a little quicker to recover that we're just animals, but we still have hurdles to get over. We were and still are desperate to be a special kind of animal. So who in history was a pioneer of understanding and promoting our true place in the world? Well, why are we all here? It's Darwin Day. It is Darwin. I'm sure you saw that one coming. Well, what were Darwin's identities, if we can continue that theme, and how did they contribute to his views on our place in the world? And these were views that in his time were surprisingly progressive. A little bit about Darwin's background, which is meaningful. His maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, who started the still operating and still profitable fine China porcelain company that bears that name. So Charles was not want for money. But his father, realizing this, didn't want his son to be an idle rich boy. So he had to have a plan for his career. And since his father was a physician, that was the first choice. He was sent off to Edinburgh Medical School. He found the lectures boring and the operations distressing. This is in the time before anesthesia. Thus, he spent most of his time generally neglecting his studies, except for learning taxidermy from a freed black slave. Annoyed by his son's lack of good performance in school, he made the check as a second choice of careers, and he sent him to Cambridge to begin his studies as a country parson. He was a middling student, but he was fascinated with naturalizing, was introduced to insects by a colleague of his, and became a fanatical beetle collector. When the opportunity arose to sail on a beagle, his father initially said no, but his uncle intervened on his behalf, reasoning that a trip on a beagle would cure him of these trivial urges, but instead what it really did was fanned the flames of his innate curiosity. But one identity that he didn't have was as the ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle. Let the surprise set in. Therein lies a story that is actually much related to his identity and is also related to the trajectory of the future of biological thought. Back in the 1960s, a science historian uncovered a letter from a prominent biologist from Edinburgh that was dated from the 1820s. It contained detailed advice on collecting, preserving, and transporting biological materials for the upcoming voyage of the HMS Beagle, actually its second voyage. But the addressee's name on the outside of the envelope was not Charles Darwin. It was a fellow named Robert McCormick. Well, McCormick was a physician in the Navy, and he distinguished himself on long subsequent prior journeys. And the British Navy had a long tradition of what were referred to as surgeon naturalists. So that was actually the official naturalist on the trip was not Darwin. So the question becomes, why was Darwin on board? Well, the captain of the Beagle was an individual named Robert Fitzroy. And Fitzroy was a very ambitious captain. He wanted to increase the scientific capacity and significance of the voyage. So he advertised to someone with, quote, geological and biological expertise to take on as what was referred to at the time as a supernumerary passenger, meaning that someone he would take on at his own expense. Now, there was a personal angle on this from Fitzroy's perspective as well, because long sea journeys at that time in history could be punishingly lonely for the captains. Navy protocol demanded that captains have virtually no contact with anyone back down the chain of command, outside of just formalized ship business. So this individual was expected to dine with the captain. Fitzroy had brought on other passengers at his own expense, but none of them were of the right social class to be able to dine with him every day. Fitzroy traced his ancestry back to King Charles II. Darwin was the son of a prominent physician of high social standing, and they met and they hit it off, so Chuck was in. But there were several other challenges to overcome. According to Darwin's correspondence, Fitzroy was concerned about having a history of mental illness, and in fact, his grandfather, who was a dignitary, military specialist who was active in suppressing a revolt in Ireland in the 1700s, at the end of his life ultimately slit his own throat. So he probably had something to worry about. Secondly, Darwin and Fitzroy were polar opposites on the political spectrum. So there were certain things that were going on in British politics they simply had to avoid, and they had to avoid it every single day. On the subject of slavery, Darwin was from a long line of abolitionists, but Fitzroy at one point crowed that he had asked a group of slaves in Brazil whether they were against slavery, and they said, of course not. Of course, it was done so in the presence of the owner of those slaves. When Darwin had the temerity to suggest their answer might have been influenced by the presence of the owner, Fitzroy exploded, threw him out to dine with the mates. Fitzroy formally apologized several days later. And finally, Fitzroy was an ardent believer in the literal truth of the Bible. There was every evidence that Darwin was well on track, probably in agreement with that, when he boarded the journey, ready to take up that country parsonship at the end. But really, who can say what 5 years at the dinner table of a tyrannical religious fanatic could do to a person? So Darwin was on board that ship because of his class identity. The history of biological thought would have been very different had this not been the case. Darwin also had the money to hire private collectors for onshore visits while the Beagle was onshore, and so his efforts at collecting looked much better than the McCormick's on board, who was the formal naturalist. Now, Darwin was a man of his time. He could have followed the fashion and thought of the day and drawn a lot of conclusions based on the various identities he may have had and the influence within that culture. As a country parson in training, he could have concluded, as was very much the orthodoxy then and now, that humans alone have a soul. I'm not aware of any such statement in any of his writings. He could easily have concluded that humans are not animals. It's clear that his researches and analysis led him to conclude that there's no fundamental gap between humans and other animals, and he put this in writing in his 1871 volume, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. He could have concluded the human capacity for communication elevated us way above other organisms in a unique way. But in 1872, he wrote an entire book on communication in animals, highlighting universal similarities. And more recently, others have elaborated on Darwin's pioneer work to further uncover how those commonalities bring us together with other organisms. Carl Sagan and Andrew Yan published a book called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors in 1992, in which they chronicled all the way that humans are supposedly unique and then knocked them down one by one. We use tools. Well, then people started paying attention to chimps who use bits of straw to extract termites from nest holes. And then we see birds armed with thorns digging grubs out of holes. Okay, we have language. But then we have Coco the signing ape. And now apparently we have Bunny, a talking dog who has a pad that he pushes on and string together any one of 92 words in grammatically systematic ways, and on and on and on. So it now seems abundantly clear what Darwin stated in the 19th century. Humans are different, not in kind and other organisms, only in degree. So he changed the way we thought about the place of humans in the world. He was part of a long line of scientists who learned from the world and critically evaluated assumptions about the uniqueness and superiority of our species. And so, from the wide open spaces of our past to the crowded landscape of our present, our tribal urges, our social and personal identities, both bind us together and push us apart. Please join me in continuing to hope that reason drives us to embrace our common humanity and heal a fragmented world. Happy 215th, Chuck.